When rest creates anxiety, is it because resting is unsafe? Or has our body been encountering how to move past exhaustion for so long that to allow ourselves to rest feels unfamiliar? Hi, I'm Jana Shalom, and this is Interrupting the Survival Spiral. In these videos, we name survival patterns and myths that many of us were taught to see as personal failure when they're actually collective. This isn't about debate or motivation. It's about clarity. And when patterns are named calmly, the nervous system has more choice. And when choice returns, this is where regulation grows. One of the questions people ask often is also one of the questions I answer almost automatically. How are you? Without much thought, I respond, I'm fine. For years, I never questioned that answer. I wasn't trying to hide anything. The words simply arrived. Someone would ask, how are you doing today? And my response was, I'm fine. And we'd both move on. Then I started noticing something. There were days I said I was fine when I clearly was not fine. I was carrying grief. There were days when I said I was fine and I clearly was not. I was carrying exhaustion. There were days I said I was fine when I was not. I was overwhelmed or disappointed or uncertain or stretched way too thin. Nothing about my answer changed. Eventually, my curiosity shifted. I started wondering whether I was actually fine. I started wondering how that answer had arrived before I even realized I was replying with it. The question opened something much larger. On this episode of Interrupting the Survival Spiral, we are exploring a simple pattern. Why does something familiar feel as though it is the truth? Survival has a quiet way of answering that question. When a response helps us move through the environment, we repeat it. What we repeat becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar gradually asks less and less of our attention. Eventually, we stop experiencing it as something we learned. It simply becomes the way things are. And that's one of survival's quiet efficiencies. The nervous system is always looking for ways to conserve energy. It doesn't evaluate every experience from beginning to end. It builds on what it already knows. Familiar responses. Familiar responses become easier to access. They're easier to trust. They're easier to repeat. Over time, we're given hundreds and hundreds of opportunities for this to embed itself into our life. The role we've played for years begins to feel like our identity. The way we've learned to navigate relationships begins to feel like this is exactly how relationships work. An adaptation slowly becomes the conclusion of who we are as a person. This is one of the ways that survival organizes our perception and what we're able to see. It doesn't ask, is this true? It asks, is this familiar enough to navigate? And that distinction matters. Familiar things tell our nervous system, I've practiced this, it must be true. Once I started to see the pattern, I found it everywhere. Sometimes it sounds like this, I'm just the responsible one. Or, I just seem to be observant. Or, I just care about other people. Or better yet, this is simply who I am. Those are all familiar, patterned responses of things we've been telling ourselves that our nervous system may now interpret as true. And some of those statements may be true, but they may also have history. The interruption isn't deciding which explanation is correct. The interruption is remembering that something that feels familiar is not necessarily evidence. Something can feel deeply true simply because it has been practiced for a long time. That changes the kinds of questions we ask. When setting a boundary, we may begin asking ourselves, is this selfish? Or is this just unfamiliar? When receiving support feels uncomfortable, is support the problem? Or is receiving something our nervous system has had little opportunity to ever receive feel unfamiliar? When rest creates anxiety, is it because resting is unsafe? Or has our body been encountering how to move past exhaustion for so long that to allow ourselves to rest feels unfamiliar? None of these things are telling us who we are. It is lending us the ability to become curious about widening our own perception. Instead of treating every familiar feeling as a conclusion, we begin seeing it as information. That doesn't make the feeling wrong. It just reminds us that things that are familiar feel true. And when we are experiencing things that are new or different, it may take time for our systems to trust that this is an okay way of being. When we have consistently been shaped through love, wisdom, and care, the way we see things is going to look very different from a life where we were shaped by inconsistency, having to earn love, and having to care for ourselves. So this invitation is extended for us to notice, when are we equating something familiar with evidence that it's true? Every survival spiral adaptation has a history. Every automatic response, I'm fine, was learned somewhere. Every familiar answer carries an entire story. So the next time that answer replies, before you've actually had a chance to, one, notice the question and pause long enough to come up with an actual answer, stay with that curiosity a little bit longer. It has a way of revealing where certainty arrived quickly. I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Sometimes that answer is still the correct answer. I'm fine. I literally am fine. But other times there's a larger story appearing in the background. And when we can allow that experience to come into the light, that's the interruption.